Welcome to Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root, where we dive deep into understanding and addressing root causes of chronic health issues so you can help and find healing inside and out, now and forever. Hello, and welcome to Trifecta Collective, Finding the Root. I'm Megan Abbott, owner and founder of the holistic health practice Trifecta Collective. Welcome to the podcast. So today, our topic is periods. What is normal? What is common? What is optimal? And why are so many of these things that we experience so normalized? And what is actually going on inside of our bodies? So where this is really coming from is, we work primarily with women, and we get so many comments, feedback, just so many women with so many chronic symptoms that have been so normalized by our society. And so many of these things are absolutely not optimal. We don't have, our periods don't have to be this massive disruptors of our lives if our body is properly supported. And so I wanted to talk today about a lot of the common symptoms, a lot of things that so many women experience. And I want to dive deeper into why this is probably happening, where this is kind of stemming from, potentially where the dysfunction may lay. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of zoom out here a little bit and talk bigger picture about hormones, how we look at hormones, and what I've seen to be some of the most successful avenues for so many women in their own hormone health and healing journey. And of course, as always, I will share some of my own common experiences. I have dealt with a wide variety of period problems throughout the years. And I mean, that's why I originally went on birth control I was put on birth control right around 15, and stayed on them for like 16 years. And yeah, and this is so many women's stories, and so many women think, well, I just have to go on birth control. That's my only option because that's what my doctor said. And they wouldn't test my hormones or they wouldn't look at anything else. Of course they won't. Let me start over a little bit. So when we look at these symptoms, and before I dive in, and I have a nice long list to go through today here in preparation for the podcast, when we have these, we'll call them period, they're really communication. It's really symptoms, signs, a way that our body's communicating with us and letting us know that something is off. And I pretty firmly believe that so many of these things are so widely accepted because there really hasn't been a lot of studies on women's health, on women's hormone health, on there's not much education even, and I know I get pushback on this sometimes, and I promise you I have seen enough OBGYNs, I have talked to enough of them, I have worked with enough women at this point who have also seen quite the variety of OBGYNs that women's health is in a real crisis. And I think it's starting to shift and change a little bit. And I also think it is largely, and I use this I use this word because I do honestly think some of it is this predatory. And if you look at, and I'm not going to go too deep into conspiracy theories, although I do love a good conspiracy theory. I don't buy into all of them, and I do love a good one. But if you really look back at how modern medicine was designed, if we look at how society is designed, if we look at the way doctors are trained right now, what are the available answers when it comes to hormone birth control? With PCOS, PMOS, maybe some other things like metformin for more metabolic stability support. It's not really, and that is often how it is portrayed. You know, and then sometimes, if you're lucky, you can have a practitioner who is familiar with HRT, hormone replacement therapy. And most of them are not well trained, well versed, have the real knowledge. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that to be mean at all. It is the reality of women's health, and that most of them are not trained. It is also a very real thing that most doctors, when it comes to women's health, there is, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, there is a real training that goes into women's health. And we can see this really across the board that we like to make things up, or we're making up or exaggerating our symptoms. And if we look at how and when pain medications are supplied and administered, it's astronomically ridiculous how long it takes us to get pain meds versus males for the same symptoms. If we look at women's health in this, we can call it a hormone crisis. I'm going to argue a few other things on this episode. When we look at perimenopause and the severity of symptoms that someone may experience, some women with PCOS, PMOS, endometriosis, some of this extreme pain that women deal with and then suffer from, and then it's just dismissed. And we're just told, just go on birth control. It's totally fine, totally safe. Please, and and I know I've mentioned this before, I am working on a birth control podcast episode. There's a lot of research that is going into this because I want to show some real, really important and big data and timelines on birth control and some other things that we are now seeing. And once again, I love a good conspiracy theory. And one of the roads I am traveling on in preparation for that episode is a little conspiracy theory. And as I'm doing deeper dives into the research, doesn't feel so conspiracy theory. And so I'm also debating on how deep I want to go into some of the history of how birth control was developed, why it was developed, and how it is now administered, and some of the studies or lack thereof, as to what is it really doing? What are the long-term impacts of birth control, and how available is a lot of that information? And so I'm doing a lot of research into a lot of the more technical aspects of that to be able to share that information with you, which is why it's taking me quite some time, as we were also very busy doing a wide variety of other things right now and preparing some additional resources and other things behind the scenes. Anyways, so when you go in, for most of us, when we go in and say, hey, I have really painful periods, or I get cramping that takes me out. I have to call out of work. I get headaches or migraines beforehand. I feel like a psychopath. I feel crazy. I feel suicidal before my period, leading up to my period, at the start of my period. So many of us are like, oh yeah, that's like just what happens. Oh, can you test my hormones? Oh, you get your period every month-ish? No, we don't need to test them. They're fine. They change all the time. I just want to rip all of my hair out. Every time I hear that. I've been told that on multiple occasions. The number of women that come in and share that information with us is astronomical. And we're also, I think a lot of us are afraid to talk about periods, perimenopause, to other women, to our male significant others, to males, blanket statement, maybe to our children. I think some of this is changing now. And we work with some younger teenage women, And, and even women in their 20s, and by the way, we also get this from women in their 30s and 40s, of what is my period supposed to look like? What is an optimal period? What does this look like? And how do I get there? What do I even need to do to my body? Because I've tried every supplement under the sun, tried to throw that on my body. And, some things have helped, some things have moved the needle a little bit, and nothing is largely moving the needle. Well, that's because so many people, when they look at a hormone problem, look at only their hormones. And, when we talk about gut health and talk about inflammation and some of these other things, we always talk about, especially in our practice, about zooming out. What is the bigger picture? When it comes to hormones, this is more important than ever. And if you haven't listened to our episode, The Impact of Stress on Hormones, I would highly recommend going back to that episode and listening to that. Either pause this episode now or after you listen, go back and listen to that. Because of a lot of the things that I am going to talk about in this episode, there's going to be a lot of overlap with that episode. And once again, I'm gonna put kind of the pieces all together in the avenues that we take to support women in their health and their hormones towards the end here. One other thing I want to dive into before I dive into all of the specific symptoms and different things is I'm going to talk a lot about stress in this episode. And stress may or may not come up under almost every single symptom that we can experience. And when I talk about stress, I always like to clarify, what do I mean by stress? So when I talk about stress, I talk about big picture stress. And that's the phrasing I like to use, big picture stress. So we have day-to-day stress. We've got work, we've got family things, we've got kids, maybe we have a significant other, we've got day-to-day financial stuff, financial planning, financial stress. We've got, busy schedules. It's summertime right now. And, vacations, while amazing, can also be very stressful. And, if you have kids, like all the camps and how do we keep them busy when they're not in school? What do what are all the things that we're doing? So we have all of this kind of more day-to-day stress. We also have, I'll say, larger picture day-to-day stress. And what I mean by this is, things like if you have aging parents, what's going to happen to them? Where are they going to go? What planning for them as they kind of go downhill? Bigger picture of your children, of, if something, are you preparing for college? What are you preparing for something bigger for them? What does that really look like? Do you have day camp, summer, at all the activities that kids can be involved in? I mean, there's so many things that can come along with children. You know, chronic illness issues, whether that's your own or someone else's close in your life. I mean, that's a big deal. Acute health crises. I think about my fiance, and his cancer journey last year. That was an unexpected big picture kind of stress that was going on that we were not planning for, that I don't think any of us would have ever hoped for that. And we had to manage our lives around that for a significant period of time. And then there was also an adjustment period out of that time frame, and for both of us, both of us individually and together. And what did that look like? I'm also preparing a podcast episode on that topic because I think it's really important. And we have all these other stressors, kind of normal stressors. And then we also have, if you're a female, we kind of have a biological clock. So do you want to have kids? Do you want to have more kids? Are you done having kids? What does that look like? What about perimenopause? Perimenopause is going to come for all of us. What is that going to look like? How is that going to impact your life? All of these things are kind of big stressors. And then we also need to look. So those are a lot of more outside kind of stressors. We can also include things like how regulated your nervous system is, how What do your practices look like to support your overall health? Do you move on a regular basis? Do you move in an appropriate way for your body and for your age? What does that really look like? And then we have inside stress. Well, how are we eating? How are we nourishing our body? Do we have nutrient deficiencies? Do we have acute inflammation? Do we have systemic inflammation? Do we have gut issues? Do we have hormone imbalances? Do we have cognitive type issues? Are we getting enough sleep? Are we sleeping in a way that's most supportive for our body? What are, like all of these things inside of our bodies also matter. Toxin load, drainage pathways, all of these things matter. And so when I talk about big picture stress, I'm talking inside and outside stress, day-to-day stress, long-term stress, short-term stress, big picture stress, little stressors, all the little things, all the little and the big things that kind of create our stress bucket that I like to talk about. And we also need to factor in, do we have a bucket? Do we have a little cup? Do we have a little bowl? Do we have a giant bucket? Because that is also going to impact our overall health. And if we're not supporting our bodies appropriately, it catches up with us. And as women, we are more sensitive. It can absolutely be a strength if we view it that way. And it can sometimes come with some less than ideal, depending on the situation, kind of side effects. It also doesn't help that society is built around men. Really, one of the easiest ways we can look at this is, at a certain age, men's testosterone drops. What are they given immediately? No questions asked. You can be put on testosterone. No questions asked. Very few questions asked. I mean, almost no questions. Females try to get testosterone and see all the hoops you have to jump through. Erectile dysfunction. How many men does this happen to? How many little blue pills are now available on the market? How cheap are they now? How readily available, even over the counter, are they available, and how cheap are they? 2023 was the first time that feminine care products were tested with real blood. 2023. There are massive discrepancies in men's versus women's health. And our hormones, our ever-changing hormones, are, I would argue, the biggest piece and reason as to why that is the case. And we're more complicated, quote unquote, more complicated to study. Not that complicated, but our bodies are more different than they are the same when it comes to men. This is why women weren't included, weren't mandatory, had to be included in most medical research until 1991. You'll also see, if you look at a lot of these studies, and if we look at some of the big medications that are, in theory, designed more for women than men, very few women they're tested on. And it's usually very young or middle-aged postmenopausal women. So we often don't even know the side effects or how our bodies will respond if you are still menstruating. Just let that sink in for just a moment here. Okay, so let's talk about these period problems and what they typically mean. All right, so first and foremost, super long and or heavy periods. Incredibly common, one of the most common ones. So what are the reasons why this is commonly happening? So low progesterone is also going to come up quite a bit here. And when I talk about low progesterone, this is typically low progesterone kind of overall. FYI, if you are going to test your progesterone, please do so in the luteal phase of your cycle. And if you don't know what your cycle phases are, we actually did a podcast episode a long time ago all about the period phases. And we talked about kind of the strengths and things to look out for during each phase of our cycle, because we do have strengths and we do have things that we should be aware of when we're thinking about our cycle, because our body is constantly changing. Our hormones are constantly changing day to day, hour by hour. And so when we look at blood work, we want to make sure we're testing at the appropriate times. When we test in the first half of our cycle, specifically day 3, is when many practitioners will recommend testing. We're not getting a great estimate on your true progesterone levels. We want to do that in the second half when our progesterone is the main hormone our body should be running. Estrogen should be lowered in our luteal phase. So why we typically don't feel quite as good in the second half is because our estrogen is lower. It is supposed to be that way for reference. Not that we're supposed to feel bad, just not quite as strong or as energized. Or estrogen does a lot with cognition, motivation, some other different things like that that can also shift things. And so when I talk about low progesterone, this can mean one of a couple things. And I'm also going to talk about high estrogen, real or perceived. And this is what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about this. So low progesterone, this is measured low progesterone, aka our body's just not producing enough. 2, this could also be an issue of our estrogen to progesterone ratios. And once again, this is changing throughout our cycles. But when we look, especially in the second half of our cycle, and it depends on what exactly we're running, which is why I'm not going to give you a very specific value here. And also the timing does change a little bit woman to woman, depending on how long your normal cycles are. So, and when or if you're ovulating. Once again, there's a lot of factors here. But if you have some basic education around this, it's actually not complicated at all. And we do have these functional ranges for reference. The research is out there. It's just not as extensive as most of us would like it to be. So we have perceived low progesterone that may be relative to our estrogen. We also could have quote unquote estrogen dominant or too much estrogen, but that could be a couple things. That could be our estrogen is higher than it actually should be, could be higher than what we would like to see it from our estrogen to progesterone ratios. Could also be an estrogen metabolism issue, meaning that our body goes through 3 phases of detoxification, and that is largely done or initiated by our liver. Estrogen is one of the things that does need to be metabolized. Most of our hormones, sex, thyroid, stress hormones, are metabolized in some way. And estrogen specifically goes through a few different phases of metabolism. And typically, especially if you've done a Dutch test, you'll know exactly, hopefully you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've had a good read on it. When you look at both phase 1 and phase 2, metabolism and or methylation, depending on who you talk to and what we're looking at, of estrogen. And sometimes it's not necessarily a progesterone issue, but it's the estrogen to progesterone ratio that's the issue. And sometimes that's an estrogen issue. Sometimes that's a estrogen metabolite or estrogen metabolism type of issue. And once again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about putting these pieces together towards the end. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this and different ways to support and kind of look at some of this. So if you have super long, super heavy periods, lowered progesterone definitely can be playing a role here. Excess estrogen or poor estrogen metabolism can also be playing a role here. I will say in most cases, estrogen metabolism is not great when we're thinking about super heavy periods. Commonly, we will see this when we lab test. Second, there can be some thyroid issues. And you're going to hear the thyroid come up a few times, which you're also going to hear me talk about cortisol and stress hormones. So all hormones can kind of play off of each other. And with women, our hormones are a little bit more sensitive. And once again, are kind of always changing on a day-to-day basis. They also can change on an hour-by-hour basis. This is why sometimes, we're not at this symptom yet, but you may feel like you were crying on the floor one moment, the next minute you want to throw something at the door squeaking. Not just perimenopause. There's a real reason why you may feel that way. Okay, so thyroid dysfunction. So we definitely want to take a look at your thyroid if you had super long and heavy periods. And then we also want to look at testosterone levels. Testosterone and androgen levels. If we think about something like PCOS, PMOS, and I'm going to say both for a while for reference when I talk about these. I know the name was recently changed, and I do have some issues with the name being changed. Not necessarily because I don't think it's a whole body metabolic issue, because I absolutely do. There are some interesting thoughts and pathways, roads that we can follow as to why this name has changed most recently. And I think we're going to start seeing more as to why a lot of us in the functional health space think the name was changed here pretty shortly when it comes to advertising of certain pharmaceuticals. So keep your eye out on that. I will not name the name of the drug, and can probably guess, or you'll see here very shortly. So elevated testosterone and or androgens can absolutely be playing a really big role in these long, heavy periods. I will tell you, like, there is one of the biggest things that can help with these really heavy periods is drainage pathway support work. And once again, this is a big thing I'm going to talk about towards the end here of like one of the biggest things that can help with period problems, drainage pathway support work. This goes such a long way. I'll tell you, especially for young women, we may not even use any supplements whatsoever. We may just look at nutrition and do a couple lifestyle things to help and support more optimal periods and hormones overall. Castor oil packs is probably one of the biggest things that we'll recommend. Super easy, can be very gentle. Don't start overnight. Start with about 15 to 30 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. Don't do 2 days in a row. And this can be a massive, massive help when it comes to quite the variety of period problems. Heavy periods is a really big one. The next one I'm going to say here is irregular periods. And what I mean by when we think about optimal periods, typically we're going to use the range of between 26 to 32 days would be considered the most optimal. Now, if you have, 22, 23, 24 days, I would consider that suboptimal. Is it a massive concern? Not necessarily. Kind of depends on who you are, how old you are, what do your periods kind of look like? What have they looked like? Is this a recent change? What, all those kinds of things. Same thing with over 32 days. If you're at 35, 40, 45, not optimal, doesn't necessarily mean that there's something terribly wrong. And once again, we just want to take a deeper look here as to why this may be happening. Biggest reasons: thyroid, stress, cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Cortisol dysregulation is use of all kind, high, low, we'll say dysfunction, just because cortisol is supposed to work on a curve and is supposed to change throughout the day. That can be a big reason. I also threw in an extra one here that I would categorize under stress, and especially if you have really elongated cycles, this is often a big one: under eating and or over exercising. Sometimes you will see, especially with people in like really big in the fitness space, who are like gym junkies and or younger athletes, they don't get their periods very often. A lot of times it's because they're underweight and or we can say overtraining, but I use that term lightly because that is relative to the person, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. When we think of very high end level athletes, this can absolutely be a thing, just especially depending on the type of sport. This can be a really big deal. Gymnastics and swimming are probably the two biggest ones where I do see a lot of under eating, overtraining going on in young women. I get it, and it is not optimal. Absolutely. We're not getting this normal period every single month, it is a red flag that our body is communicating that something is off, something is not in the most optimal place, or a variety of things are not in the most optimal place. And we want to take a deeper look at it. But that is a big one. The other thing I'll say here is once you start into perimenopause, one of the things that's going to happen is your periods are going to get shorter. for most women. And then usually they get shorter and then they become more sporadic. Largely, this is due initially, especially to the change in progesterone. Progesterone is the first thing that's going to start to drop when we go into perimenopause. And so you'll see progesterone play a big role in a lot of these symptoms that I'm talking about. If we think about, if I go into the next one here, brown blood, brown, like that darker brown, like not the bright red blood, but the darker kind of, yeah, sometimes it's like a full on brown. Sometimes it's like a little like brown, dark red kind of thing at the very beginning or very end. Also a sign of low progesterone. And this can happen to women at any age, but especially when we go into perimenopause, when that progesterone starts to drop, one of the biggest things we see. One of the biggest things I can recommend to you, if you are a menstruating female of any age, if you aren't already, track your cycles, including your symptoms. This is something we do with so many of our female clients, and man, the amount of data that we get just for some basic tracking, even just 1 month, but let alone 2 to 3 months, we start to see the same symptoms pop up on the same days. We can tell you exactly why that's happening, how to support your body, maybe something short term to do and or long term, depending on what the issue is. And it is so valuable. It's also so valuable because look, perimenopause can happen way earlier than you think it can. They say 35 is like, can be a common start time. I was in perimenopause at 29. It does not have an age range. Knowing when your cycles start to change, extremely helpful and valuable information. Sometimes there's a specific reason, sometimes there's not. Either way, this can be very valuable information. And if you don't like the idea of using a specific app to do this, handwritten notes can go a long way. Keep just a document on your computer or on your phone, like a little note app, and just keep track of that. Put it on your calendar. Just whatever you feel most comfortable with, do it that way. But if you menstruate, this is one of the most helpful things that we can really look at. And some women come into us with all of this information already, and man, is it massively helpful. And we don't absolutely have to have it, because we're probably also going to continue to look at it as we go and work with a client. So irregular periods, we talked about the brown blood, bowel movement changes. Most commonly, this is going to look like before your period, like a few days before your period, you might get constipated. And then once your period starts, the more colloquial name, if you're not familiar with this, is the period poops. You might have some looser type stools that start to happen. Largely, this is going to be a prostaglandin issue. And if you're not familiar with prostaglandins, let me tell you a little bit about them, because this is not going to be the only time I mention them. So prostaglandins are, and I am going to read the technical definition here to you, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how we see this play a role. So prostaglandins are lipid compounds with hormone-like activity produced at sites of tissue injury or illness. And I hate the fact that they use that phrase, because they play such a big role in menstruation and in birth and giving birth as well. If they play a really big role here, it almost makes it sound like that alone, either one of those, is an injury or illness, which these are natural things our bodies were designed to do. We're designed to be able to give birth. We're designed to have periods, to go through perimenopause, go into menopause, and it's not supposed to be this massive disruptor of our lives, potentially, for some people forever. So these prostaglandins are responsible they do a lot with inflammation, circulation, clotting, and then uterine muscle contractions that are both involved in birth and menstruation. So they play a big role in this. So they're lipids, which if we think of like cholesterol is also lipids. Cholesterol is also really important just overall for hormones. And high cholesterol, especially your LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. And I'm talking LDL-C, HDL-C, and triglycerides, if you want to get really technical here, not LDL-P and, your particle size and HDL-P, different. That's looking at more cardiovascular type health from a true cardiovascular standpoint, looking at details of our lipid profile, of our cholesterol profile. These prostaglandins, though, so they're lipid-like. Lipids are transport units for many things, most oftentimes. And when we think about these standard cholesterol markers, once again, HDL-C, LDL-C, triglycerides, they are carriers of different things. Two of the big things that they carry are hormones, like sex hormones, and also neurotransmitters. All the drugs that make you happy inside your body. Keep that in mind when I continue on this conversation. Okay, so when we have an issue with these prostaglandins, and a lot of times I will tell you this is often related to a drainage pathway dysfunction. We can be producing too many or not enough. They can also be overactive or underactive. But I'll tell you one of the biggest things, once again, if you are someone who experienced these bowel movement changes, drainage pathway support work throughout your cycle goes an incredibly long way. I still do extra drainage pathway support work the week before my period. And if you've heard me on this podcast, I have walked you through a variety of things that I've dealt with from a hormone perspective, especially over the last year or so. And this is big. And I'll tell you, I've really doubled down on this the last few months, and my last few periods have been way better. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but that is one of them. I do count that as one. I'm doing, especially castor oil packs for me right now are the easiest and simplest thing for me to do. So I'm doing those probably 3 or 4 times a week, the week before my period. And then I'm also using a variety of supplements, drainage pathway support supplements. This is largely looking like from Cellcore. Just, I love their products when it comes to drainage pathway support work. Tedka's my absolute favorite. Kale support, not far behind. I'll do the kale support more so when I'm on my period as just like a way to support those organs. Lymph Active is a really good one though for lymphatic support, and that can be really supportive during this period of time. But I also really heavily rely on the drainage, like the lifestyle things. And then I'm going to talk about one other thing that when I get into estrogen metabolism here in just a bit. Okay, clots. I'm talking large clots, like the size of quarters and more than a couple, and or more than a couple. So if you have big clots like quarter size or above, not normal, no matter how many or how few there are, for reference. If you have a handful of little clots, just little tiny kind of clots, like the size of a penny or less, and you have a few of them, that's okay. That I would consider that normal, consider that optimal. It's totally fine. But if you have a boatload of clots and or they're really big, thyroid is the first thing we want to look at. The thyroid plays a really big role in breaking down clots. And a lot of times that's an early indication of a thyroid dysfunction kind of issue. It could also be a prostaglandin issue. So that's why we also want to look at prostaglandins, and that's why doing some drainage pathway support work can also go a really long way. Okay. Intense cramping. Prostaglandin kind of issue can absolutely be playing a role here because they manage a lot of that uterine muscle contraction kind of, I don't want to say issues, but uterine contraction overall. If we're getting those really intense cramps, it's an over contraction. We're getting really painful contractions, and sometimes you can feel it. Sometimes it almost feels like a fibroid bursting. Sometimes it is, by the way. And we can feel that. And like sometimes our uterus, when we're having our period, doesn't just like contract and then it's done. It'll contract and then you'll get a break and then it might contract again. And that's why sometimes for cramping, it can feel like it's really bad all the time, but sometimes it's like you almost get waves. It comes in waves, and that's largely more of a prostaglandin. If it's coming in the waves more like that, often more prostaglandin type issues, in which case drainage pathway support work can play a really big role here. Real or perceived estrogen dominance. once again, this is a huge factor when it comes to like the really intense cramping and or the estrogen, we'll say clearance, estrogen metabolism. Once again, this is why drainage pathway support work can also be super, super helpful. So we want to look at, are you clearing estrogen? And there are some other ways that we can also support our body through clearing that estrogen. And we'll talk about that towards the end here. Next one, darker and or abnormal hair growth. So this would be the chin hairs, cheek hairs, lip hairs, just above your lip kind of hairs. This might be the nipple hairs, the lower belly, under your belly button, kind of the happy trail. This might be like the random dark kind of hairs that just pop up. It might be almost like a dark mustache or even like a little bit of a beard, or sometimes it's just like little random guys that you're just plucking out and or shaving. And then a lot of women end up getting waxed or laser hair removal or a variety of the other things because we're told we're not supposed to look like that. And once again, this is your body's way of communicating with you. This is largely androgen and or testosterone related. We're either producing too much and or we're not clearing them out quite enough. In which case that is a drainage pathway issue more so than an overproduction type of issue. We want to look at both. Next one here. Hungrier before your period. So like we can say up to a week before your period, especially the few days before your period, and then maybe like the first day or two of your period, you're hungrier. This one is normal. This is actually optimal, and this should happen. Now, if you're having intensive cravings, like where you need to eat a bag of candy to quench your sweet tooth, little different here. What I'm talking about is some mild, just increase in appetite. This is supposed to happen the week before a period. Our bodies need anywhere between about 100 to 500 extra calories during that time period. If you are closely tracking all of your food and calories and all that kind of stuff, some coaches will do this, some won't. And I also think this largely depends on the person and what this might need to look like or might be most beneficial to look like. So we should be eating a little bit more, not a ton. 100 calories is not much more for reference. But this is actually to help our bodies feel safe because our bodies are working harder, which means we need more energy. We need more fuel. We need more calories. And if we don't give it to our body, we can actually hold on to excess weight. That might look like body fat. That might look like water weight. That might look like inflammation. Depends on the person. Over time, if we're chronically undereating, blanket statement, especially during this week before our period, this can be a huge contributor to struggles in losing weight and or keeping weight off. Also, if you're craving certain things, dark chocolate is one of the most common things to crave during this period of time. It's usually because your body's craving extra magnesium. And dark chocolate has extra magnesium in it. It is naturally occurring magnesium. And so your body's usually craving extra magnesium because stress is a little bit higher, because your body's working harder in preparation for your menstrual cycle. So this is totally normal. Once again, like if you get like ravenous, we might want to look at gut health. We might want to look at a couple other things, but this is extremely common. Okay. I'm going to go a little bit faster here because I've got a lot and I was only planning on doing one. You know what? Maybe I will do a 2-part episode on this now that I'm thinking about it. Okay. I think I want to do one more and then I'm going to save the rest for part 2. So the next one here, I guess the last one I'm going to do on this episode is going to be mood swings and PMS. I'm also going to save PMDD for the next one because I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive and share some additional thoughts around PMDD because this holds a particular new place in my heart because I experienced some of this a few months ago and I haven't quite talked about it yet. And I do really want to talk about it because I think this is super important and something so many women struggle with. that I want to spend a little extra time on that. I also want to spend a little extra time on skin, on breakouts and some of the root causes of breaking out during our cycles and throughout our cycles. So I do want to do a deeper dive into that. So, okay, let's circle back here. Mood swings and PMS. So one of the biggest reasons is this estrogen to progesterone ratio. This could be your estrogen is too high. Your estrogen's too high in relation to your progesterone. Your progesterone's too low, especially too low in comparison to your estrogen. And or we're getting some pretty wild fluctuations here. So when we think about perimenopause, and I'm going to just reference this and compare it to this because I think this is easier to understand. So when we go into perimenopause, the first thing that's happening is our progesterone is doing a steady decline. For some women, this is a nice, slow, steady decline. For other women, this feels like falling off a sharp cliff. Depends on the person, depends on where your your progesterone levels were from the starting point. But these fluctuations in progesterone are no joke. And if you're curious about hormones and how they relate to other parts of our body, especially our mental and emotional health, the part 3 episode of perimenopause that I did a deep dive into this. I talked about estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, and how our levels, and in particular, our changing levels of these hormones impact other parts of our body, including cardiovascular health, bone health, brain health, both from a cognition and a mood standpoint. Estrogen and progesterone especially play a really big role in our mental and emotional health. So when we get big fluctuations here, whether that's a short dip in the progesterone, which is what can happen during perimenopause. By the way, this isn't only a perimenopausal thing. I'm going to talk about a couple other things here as I go through this. The other thing that happens during perimenopause that once again can happen to us before that too is our estrogen starts to go on this massive roller coaster where it goes up and then it comes down and then it's up and then it's down. And then we might have some little fluctuations. And then we go back and have big, huge fluctuations and dips and spikes, and we're all over the place. It will literally drive you crazy because of the role that estrogen and progesterone play on your brain health, on your mental and emotional health, on your gut health. All of these things really, really matter. And so if we're having estrogen to progesterone ratio issues, if we're producing not enough or too much of either or both of these, and or we're getting these massive fluctuations, this is the craziness of PMS. And this is what it feels like. This is why you can go from crying on the floor one moment and you're crying about literally nothing, or a commercial that you saw that was mildly emotional and did not technically warrant this level of reaction, and you are experiencing a way heightened. And by the way, I know what this feels like. I am a woman. I'm a menstruating woman as well. I've been here. I know what this feels like. So this can be a really big role. And once again, I have found throughout my own health and healing journey that having some knowledge about what is happening in my body brings me a certain level of comfort. And so the week before my period, if I'm experiencing some of these hormonal, mental, and emotional kind of shifts, I know why. And I'm not going to lie and say it's easier, because I'm not sure it's easier. But I also, just the comfort of knowing that that is what is happening inside of my body brings me some relief. And I'm like, okay, it's the week before my period. I know my estrogen and or progesterone is going all over the place. I have had a very stressful month, and I knew I was prepared that this was going to happen, and I'm just going to do the best I can to support my body. And we'll see in the part 2, I'm going to talk more into how do we support our bodies and support proper hormone production, regulation, clearance, metabolism, all of those things. We're really going to do a deep dive into that. Okay, so these estrogen progesterone ratios and changes, fluctuations, all that kind of stuff can play a big role here. Our HPA axis, and more likely HPA axis dysfunction, can also play a big role here. And by HPA axis, I'm talking about your hypothalamus, your pituitary, your adrenal axis, your HPA. This is also your stress axis, primary stress axis. This is what is going to produce cortisol inside of your body. And when we are producing too much, too little, we're not metabolizing cortisol. If we're not, there's a whole, we can talk about cortisone. All of these things play a big role here. This will also impact your mental and emotional health. It can also, and once again, I'm going to talk about this in the next episode, this can exacerbate a lot of the thoughts and feelings that you're experiencing. The racing, looping thoughts, the anxiety out of nowhere, the thinking about, something, a conversation you had in 5th grade to this person that you haven't talked to in 30 plus years, probably cortisol related. The thing you're thinking about, if you were to land on Mars, and what would you want to do with your whole life, thinking in 30 years ahead of you, and on all of these like future casting scenarios, can also be cortisol related. And those are real things that have happened to me for reference. So I'm not just pulling this out. Those are real-time examples of places my brain has gone during this time. So that can play a really big role. And then just to talk a little bit deeper. So when we talk about, and I put some additional notes here that I probably should have talked about here when I was talking about the estrogen to progesterone ratios. So with estrogen specifically, estrogen has a direct impact on serotonin, dopamine, and GABA systems. So if we think about these 3 symptoms, what do they kind of symbolize? Mood, stability. I think we all, if you're a menstruating female, I think most of us know what mood instability feels like for sure. Also impacts your motivation. So if you feel less motivated to do things around the house, to do things at work, and you're like, I don't care. I just have no motivation to do any of these things. Hormones could absolutely be playing a role here. And also the calming feelings. This is a big one. So you have in your second half of your cycle, you have way less capacity to be calm, to manage stress. And when we talk about progesterone, so progesterone plays a really big role in a variety of things when it comes to your neurotransmitters. The GABA A receptors, which are different than some of the things that estrogen impacts, but our GABA A receptors have a lot to do with calming, anti-anxiety, once again, mood stability, but also buffers our stress response. And I've shared this before. So when cortisol goes up, progesterone goes down. They have an inverse relationship. So stress goes up, your progesterone's naturally going to go down. So if you're stressed for, I don't know, let's say decades of your life, let alone those of us who have only been stressed for months or years, of course this is going to have an impact on your hormones. Of course your hormones are going to be all over the place and you're going to have no chill. This is also why when we get into perimenopause, there's so much stuff going around TikTok and social media right now of like, you lose your filter during perimenopause. You lose your ability to give an F. Yes and no. It's really your progesterone that's playing the biggest role in that. And so when you feel like that the week before your period, it's a real biological thing that is happening to you. It's not just you're crazy, you've got you need to work on your mental and emotional health, you just need an SSRI that's going to fix everything. Not quite. That's not quite how this works. And that's why when they will not do testing on you and their first response when you go to an OBGYN is, oh, do you want an SSRI? I want to rip all of my hair out. Just all of it. I just want to rip it out because as a physician, as someone who in theory should have taken years of physiology and should understand how the body works, you have no clue how the body works. And the role that gut health, on toxin load, that hormones play on our mental and emotional health, you have no idea. And so you're unwilling to look at any of this stuff, which is mind-blowing. I'll also tell you some functional practitioners will only look at the hormone stuff or they won't look at it at all, which is also mind-blowing. If we think about holistic health, we need to look at everything all together. So I'm going to pause there for right now, and I'll do a part two, and I'll talk about, I have a handful of other symptoms that I'm also going to talk about here. I've got a good number of these symptoms too. And once again, I've got a few I want to really dive into, including PMDD, including hormonal breakouts, in skincare, just kind of overall. And then in the second half, I'll also talk more about what do we do to support hormone health from an acute standpoint, from like a short-term kind of standpoint, but also once again, zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, which is the mistake I see most practitioners, even though in the holistic health space, miss is they don't look at the whole picture. They're like, oh, you have hormone problems? Okay, well, let's look at your hormones. And then they're only looking at your hormones. They're maybe running some blood tests. Maybe they're running a Dutch test, which is a urine test. Maybe they're running a saliva test to look at your hormones, but they're only focused on your hormones. Our hormones are impacted by so many things. And so I want to talk about a lot of those and why we don't look at hormones first and foremost, and also some of the intermediary support we may recommend and or provide with someone, with a woman who does come in with a lot of hormone imbalances, and how we want to support her body and give her some, even if it's just temporary relief while we work on the bigger stuff. What does that often look like? Where do we kind of start with that? And what are some things that we can do? So thank you for listening. Be sure to stay tuned for part two. I'm going to try and make it so that part two comes out right after this, the week after this. So be sure to stay tuned for part two. And as always, please like, subscribe, follow. If it resonates, 5-star reviews really, really, really mean the world to us. I promise, like, I look at those and it warms my heart every time we get one. I mean, it literally makes my day every time we get one. I feel so grateful, because sometimes with podcasting, we just never know. We put it out and I hope for the best. And anytime anyone brings it up to me, they're like, oh, by the way, I've been listening to your podcast and I found it so good. It's so helpful. I'm like, warms my heart, fills my heart right up there. So they really do, really, it really, really, really does mean the world to me, and us as a whole practice. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.